Hello, can you hear me? All in here. We might need more chairs. Thanks. Yes.
Can hear you.
Not possible. I'm getting another chair. In front. Aaron, I need him to allow sharing, screen sharing.
Is in the video? Oh, thank you.
Yeah, I just I can
Do you want me
share
to make you host, or do you want me to
just allow sharing.
and do you want me to not allow sharing?
No, just allow no sharing.
You are under a co-host. You are under Phil.
I'm under sure that's me.
I can make you co-host. Reason is if I'm on there, I can also start.
Yeah, exactly. You can
You can't make that. As long as I got back.
Can those of you on the Zoom see the PowerPoint?
Yes, we can.
Okay, hopefully you can see and hear.
Thank you.
So maybe if Mr. Goldberg sits here, they can also see it when we do. It's going to be sitting here. And then you can sit next to him. Okay, perfect. So to move the slides, you can either use that or you can just use the clicker, whichever you prefer. Do you think Mr. Goldberg will use the microphone?
And he just realized.
You're just gonna have to be quiet. Okay, that's all. Okay, if you want, just. So they can also see you on the film. Turn it off for now. I don't want it. You're gonna sit on that one. Do you mind? I think you just at that side, so I can see you on the computer.
See. Maybe she's.
Yeah, next to you. Oh, do you want to see one? Oh, there we go. And you can use this if you want to move it forward.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Good evening, everyone. As a grandson of a Holocaust survivor, it's an honor to introduce our guest tonight, Mr. Manfred Goldberg. There's a passage from Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sachs that has always stayed with me and I want to share with you. Though the two are often confused, memory is different from history. History is someone else's story. Memory is my story. It's about where I come from and of what narrative I am a part. History answers the question, what happened? Memory answers the question, who then am I? It is about identity and the connection between the generations. Tonight, we're not just here to learn history. We're here to receive memory, to connect with who we are and with the generations before us. Mr. Goldberg was born in Germany in 1930. He survived the ghetto, slave labor camps, and eventually rebuilt his life here in the UK. But more than that, he chose to speak and educate, not with bitterness, but with hope. In the words of Rabbi Sachs, to be free, you have to let go of hate. Remember the past, but do not be held captive by it. Mr. Goldberg has devoted his life to ensuring that the horrors of the Shoah are never forgotten, so that memory becomes a blessing, not just a warning. It is a privilege to welcome him here tonight. Please join me in listening and remembering Mr. Manfred Goldberg.
Ladies and gentlemen, after this introduction, I have quite a bit to live up to. I'll do my best. I will begin with a very brief resume of my parents, my family. Both my parents were... Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
All of you? Yes. Both my parents were born in Poland. Around the end of the First World War, both of them, not knowing each other as singles, they both made their way into Germany for different reasons. They met in Germany, married there, settled in that town, which was called Kassel, and as a result, I was their firstborn, born in 1930, as was mentioned, and I have a younger brother called Chaim, born in 1934. It is relevant to remember that my parents were born in Poland. My father settled in this town. He became a textile merchant, and there were two communities really in our town in Kassel. There were around 5,000 Jews living among a total population of 250,000. The vast majority of these Jewish people were German-born, many of them fairly assimilated, not all, but the majority. The majority also had lived in Germany for generations, many of them for well over 100 or maybe even 200 years. And they have really become Germans of the Jewish persuasion, as I've heard it said. And they were not very happy with the growing influx of Polish refugees who came mainly post-First World War, because they were too Jewish. They were rocking the boat for them. As a result, there were really two separate kahillas there. The Polish Jews were frum, didn't want to daven in their Beit Midrashim, in their synagogues. Some of them actually had organs playing. So there were really two separate kahillas there. And there was only one Jewish primary school in our town, which was designed and mainly catered for the children of the German Jewish sector, but generously they allowed children of Polish origin also to attend. And that's the school I eventually attended. I was only 3 years old when the Nazis came to power. I was too young to really understand the consequences, but slowly but surely it became apparent. When I was 6 years old, I was enrolled into the only Jewish school I've mentioned. And at age 6, the Nazis had passed many, many anti-Jewish laws. One of them was that every Jewish person, male and female, from the age of 6 up, had to wear a Magen David, a yellow star, on their outer garment when they left the house. And that, of course, identified us as Jews and really opened us to thoughts, sometimes physical, sometimes just verbal. I see that.
Yeah, thank you.
So that is the outer garment, the yellow star we had to wear with the word Jews written across it. That, of course, made me realize what being a Jew now meant in Germany. On our way to and from school, sometimes youngsters who had been brainwashed because the Nazis formed a nationwide youth group called the Hitler Youth, equivalent sort of nominally to, I say, the Boy Scouts perhaps, but their prime aim was to indoctrinate into Jew hatred these youngsters, both in the hope that they would be the backbone of the Nazi regime, and probably or possibly they would pass on their Jew hatred to their parents to make it easier for the Nazis to have a large following. It really became quite apparent that Jews were slowly but surely being choked. They passed a law that no Jew was allowed to enter any non-Jewish shop in town. Most shops had notices on their entry saying Jews not permitted, Jews not wanted, Jews forbidden. We had to do all our shopping in one shop in town. Jewish businesses were being expropriated. The Nazis began approaching the owners, usually of sort of reasonably sized shops, retail shops. And that was their life's achievement, their panossa. And they would offer a derisory sum, like pocket money, less than 10% of the value of this business, and ask them to sign a sale contract. Of course, usually that person was reluctant, and if they couldn't persuade them any other way, that they made dire threats that their family and they would be sent to a concentration camp. By then, there were concentration camps open in Germany, so that eventually the unfortunate shop owner had no alternative but to sign away his livelihood. That was just one of many ways they persecuted Jews. Eventually, something really drastic happened. They passed a law that any Jew working for a non-Jewish firm had to be dismissed, no matter how satisfied their employers were. Jews were not allowed to work for non-Jews. And Jews were also more or less forbidden to have businesses of their own by then. So it led to great hardship. Many other restrictions were placed on Jews. I don't have time to go into them all, but I mentioned that both my parents were born in Poland. First of all, in November 1938, a major atrocity occurred across large parts of Germany. You more than likely have heard of it. It's called Kristallnacht, the night of the broken glass. This was on the 9th of November, 1938. It was kept secret. Any Jew caught on the street was attacked. In every locality where Jews resided on that evening, a smallish group of Nazi soldiers, usually followed enthusiastically by adults who had been brainwashed into Jew hatred, roamed the streets, and if they met any unfortunate Jew out in the street, they were attacked. On that night, across Germany, in every locality where the Jews were residing, large or small numbers, this is what happened. Jews were attacked, more than 100 were murdered that day, and many hundreds were injured. They, in addition, made their way usually into the business quarters, and any shop or business that was known to be Jewish-owned was forcibly entered, ransacked. They stole what they could and destroyed what they could not take away. In that manner, on that one night, more than 7,000 Jewish businesses were destroyed. In addition, they also attacked and both defaced synagogues, and in addition, they entered, destroyed Sefer Torah, holy books, and if the shul was in its own grounds, often they set it on fire. All that happened on that one night. It was unbelievable, and many academics believe that this was one of the ways the Holocaust really began in earnest. In 1938, earlier, before the Kristallnacht, there was an international conference called by America because people began to criticize America for not allowing more Jews to enter. They had an annual visa quota of 30,000, a waiting list of 300,000. And they made it so difficult to get hold of one of these life-saving visas that in some years they didn't even issue the quota of 30,000. People just could not meet the conditions imposed to qualify for a visa. They gathered 32 nations to meet in France. It was known as the Evian Conference. They talked for 2 weeks, ostensibly to assist Jews to ensure that there would be more plentiful visas available for Jews to leave. Each of their representatives was very supportive of the Jewish situation, but of course they went on. Unfortunately, our country is not in a position to help, but I'm sure the others will. Well, everyone had the same story, and the end result was zero. Nothing happened. In fact, some academics believe that this conference, by its public statement of indifference towards Jews in danger of their lives, actually gave him the green light to go ahead with his extermination plans. He calculated in the event pretty correctly that he could get away with doing what he intended to do, mass extermination, without any serious consequence internationally. In April, around April, Pesach time of 1939, my father, Olaf Sholem, was arrested. He was deported to Poland. The Nazis decided that although he had given up his Polish nationality 20 years earlier when he entered Germany, he was Polish after all, and they deported him back to his country of birth. The Poles refused to keep him, sent him back to Germany. He was then arrested and said they would send him to a concentration camp instead. My mother, Olea Sholom, knowing the situation, actually was brave by contacting the Nazi authorities and pleading for my father's freedom, saying he'd lived here for 20 years with a respectable family, he'd always obeyed all the laws of the country we lived in. But they said the only possibility of avoiding concentration camp is if he could show an entry visa to another country. But that, of course, was the difficulty. As I mentioned to you, it was almost impossible to get visas to anywhere. Many Jews actually hired smugglers to take them illegally across borders into adjoining countries, land borders like France, Belgium, Holland, thinking that settling in one of those countries, they have escaped the Nazi assault. Unfortunately, of course, the Nazis occupied all those countries, and very often, with help from the local authorities, they rounded up practically all these Jews who were sent to the camps and ended up in the death camps. That was the situation for Jews. Things got from bad to worse. Jews had to hand in all their jewelry, diamonds, insurance policies. And there was no way people could really save themselves. There was a trickle of visas being issued. My father was still arrested, and my mother tried every possibility of getting a visa for him, unsuccessfully. Eventually, somehow, she was inspired. She went on a train quite a distance to Berlin. She spoke to the chief passport officer of the British consulate in Berlin, told him a heartbreaking story, and he was really emotionally aroused by what he heard. And there and then he wrote out a single visa entitling my father to enter the UK as a refugee. And he promised my mother that in a matter of 6 to 8 weeks, he hoped to be able to be in a position to issue visas to us, to the family, to follow my father to the UK where we would be reunited. The Nazis insisted that to make use of this visa, he had to leave Germany within 24 hours, taking just 5 marks and a small suitcase with him. Reluctantly, very reluctantly, but under the impression that our separation would only be for a matter of a few weeks, he did so. He made his way to the UK. He left Germany on the 20th of August, 1939. 10 days later, on the 1st of September, the Nazis attacked Poland. The UK declared war on Germany, and as the two countries were at war, we were trapped in Germany. We could no longer leave Germany to join my father in the UK. Which meant, in fact, in practice, that my father had to live in the event for more than 6 years with the agony of not knowing the fate of his family. There was absolutely no contact between us. Two countries were at war. He didn't know whether we were alive, whether we were still in Germany, whether we'd been taken elsewhere. And I like it to imagine the agonizing experience of night after night lying there wondering about the fate of one's family, a wife and 2 children in his case. My mother, Olea Sholem, now had to look after us 2 children. I was 9 when the war began, and my little brother was 5. He incidentally was later murdered illiterate. He never had a days of schooling because very soon after Kristallnacht, the Nazis closed down the Jewish school I had been attending, and many Jewish children, particularly from the more assimilated sector of Jews, attended state schools, non-Jewish schools in town. They were all expelled. Every Jewish child was expelled from school. Our Jewish school was shut down. And there was no education for any Jewish child any longer. In my case, this lasted for 7 years. I didn't have a day's schooling for 7 years. We stayed at home. My mother did her best. She was not a trained teacher, but she tried to teach us little bits at home. My brother, of course, was very young, hardly. He wasn't qualified to go to school yet. She tried to teach me, but it didn't amount to very much. And she looked after us by using our fairly meager family savings. In this manner, we managed to survive, having to do all our shopping from the one shop. Often there was a shortage. If they ran out of some item you needed, you had to do without. Not allowed to enter a non-Jewish shop. I don't have time to go into detail, but it became pretty desperate at times. And on at least 2 occasions, my mother, Leah Sholem, sent me into a non-Jewish baker's shop, covering up my yellow star, asking for a loaf of bread when there was no one in the shop, and running out and passing it on to my mother. No Jewish mother would have risked their child's life unless the situation was really, really demanding it. I guess my mother would be ready to suffer hunger, but she couldn't bear to see her children hungry, and that is why we did what we did. In December 1941, 2 Nazi soldiers came to our home and told my mother she had 10 minutes to pack a suitcase for the 3 of us. They waited, and when the case had been packed, they escorted us to the railway station, where we met a group of Jews already assembled, each one accompanied by a suitcase. And when our number there had grown to just around 1,000, I managed to look it up once, and I think it was 996 of us who were deported that day. We were packed into a train and set off on a journey into the unknown. We traveled for 3 days and nights. No food was given to us, but the majority of Jewish mothers, being Jewish mothers, all had packed some food into their cases. And that's how we kept going for 3 days. Train stopped at the end of 3 days. We were ordered out. We found we'd been taken to a colder climate. There was now snow and ice on the ground. We were surrounded by armed guards, and they lined us up into a long column and walked us into a town which we found out very soon was called Riga. The image you see on the screen, bottom left, it shows Kassel, the town where we lived. Top right, the arrow points at the town of Riga, which was the capital city of Latvia. You see they schlepped us 1,000 miles through a number of countries. We had to go through the west of Germany, Poland, Lithuania, right up to Latvia. They walked us into the town of Riga, and at the far end of the town, the very poor end of Riga, we were walked into a small area of Riga town, which had been surrounded by a barbed wire. We were walked in through a gate, which was then locked, and we were locked in there. That became our home. It was practically empty. There were a small number of Jews there. We soon found out 2 things. One, that every few days, another transport of around 1,000 Jews from a different town in Germany arrived to swell the numbers in the Riga ghetto. And also, we found an explanation because when we were housed in grossly overcrowded small houses, we found that belongings which evidently had belonged to Jewish people were found there. And I hope I have time, I will explain to you, but you can take it from me, what I'm telling you is first-hand knowledge given to me by a survivor of an atrocity. When the Nazis occupied Riga 6 months or so before we arrived, they forced all 30,000 Jews living in Riga to leave their homes and move into this ghetto, which they had built in a very short time, just by taking out the poor non-Jewish Latvians who had lived there, and putting a barbed wire fence around, and then packing 30,000 Jews into that small area. It meant more than one family had to share a room. One morning, apparently, they told the Jewish occupiers of the ghetto that they were being taken to another camp, and in groups they marched them out of the camp. Instead, Jews thinking they were going to another camp, they marched them into a nearby forest where they had prepared 3 enormous pits. And as each group approached, they were shot. Probably, almost certainly, not all of them were murdered, some were just injured, but they were all thrown into one of these pits. And eventually, these pits were covered up and became mass graves, which are there to this day in that forest outside Riga. In a matter of less than 2 weeks, they had murdered all Jews from the Riga ghetto. It's now empty. We heard from 30 survivors who were allowed to survive this atrocity. And they are the ones who told us about it. They were allowed to survive because they had all been to university, spoke fluent German, and the Nazis decided it would be useful if they were appointed internal camp police. They were known as kapos, an abbreviation for camp police. And they are the ones who had witnessed this, told us about it. In that manner, they had provided accommodation for us. The ghetto was now refilled, having murdered all the Latvian occupiers of the ghetto. It was now filled with Jews from Germany, and we were addressed by a Nazi officer who told us several things. One, that everyone over the age of 13 would have to go to work. They would be marched in groups under escort into factories in town to manufacture things to assist the war effort. And the picture on the PowerPoint shows you one such group being escorted to go to work in the morning. I was aged 11 at the time, my little brother was 7, so we had to stay in the camp. I was in charge of my 7-year-old brother, had to keep him under control all day long, hungry as he was, and as we all were, because the day we arrived, we were put on a starvation diet. And this diet continued relentlessly without a single break until the day of my liberation, 3.5 days later.
Years.
Pardon?
Years later.
3.5 years later, there was not a day when we were not hungry from morning to night. Because the starvation diet, it was very similar in each camp. In the morning consisted of a slice of bread, especially baked bread, which we were told, well, unofficially, it contained something like 50% of sawdust, and a warm drink of some sort. And in the evening, when we came home from work, we were given a ladle full of some broth, which was mainly colored water with potato peels floating in them, not potatoes. They went to the military potato peel, carrot peel, cabbage peel. That is what we were served. It really was a very, very tough period. It was not easy looking after children. Many children were left totally unattended because we had two boys. I could look after my little brother, but some children were left totally unattended. There was one Jewish teacher who had been deported with us, and he approached the internal Jewish administration in each camp. They selected a number of people who had been prominent in their hometowns, and they called it the Judenrat, so Jewish Advisory Council. When the Nazis issued commands, they would pass them on to this council, and they were responsible for executing these demands on behalf of the Nazis. And this teacher approached them for one room. They should give him the use of one room. Eventually he succeeded, and all the children from our town assembled in that room each day so he could look after us and care for the smaller children in particular. He formed us into a choir, teaching us Jewish melodies like Adonalon, Yigdal, etc., which many of us knew. And one day he came up to me and said, "Your 12th birthday has passed. Your bar mitzvah is coming up. Would you like me to help you? I know your father is not with you." He did, and he calculated in his head what my bar mitzvah parsha would be 1 year ahead. He actually got it practically right, remarkably, without the aid of a luach, just by calculating in his head. He began teaching me, and then he found I learned easily. He taught me the whole parsha of the south, which he decided was my parsha. On the day of my bar mitzvah, there was never any religious service in any of the camps I was in. The only time I had a religious service was on the day he suggested was my bar mitzvah. On that morning, somehow miraculously, 9 men appeared, and I was number 10 to make up a minyan. I have not told you that when the Riga Jews had to leave their homes and move into the Riga ghetto, they were allowed to take a number of items, personal items, with them into the camp. And of course, many religious Jews, particularly rabbis of communities, took a Sefer Torah. So there were Sefer Torah and many other belongings in the camp, in this ghetto. When they were all marched to their death, as I mentioned to you, they were not allowed to take anything. So we found all their belongings. And one of those Sefer Torah was used on my bar mitzvah Shabbos. It was a strange bar mitzvah because I had no tefillin. There were no tefillin around. And there was no kiddush either, incidentally. But it is stuck in my memory, and I will never, ever forget that teacher. I found out post-war, not so long ago, that he was in fact, a year later, sent to an extermination camp and murdered. But not forgotten. I will never forget him as long as I live. This happened in March 1943. In August of that year, incidentally, when the Nazi officer told us that they all had to work, he gave us a number of instructions. Another one was that we would lose our names. Each of us was given a number. My number was 56478. And we had to remember these numbers. We had to remind ourselves in our head. And we often were ordered to shout out our numbers, which we had to do without hesitation. Because if you became confused, you were liable to be punished by 2 lashes from a whip. As a result, 5, 6, 4, 7, 8 will stick in my mind for as long as I live. In August 1943, we were lining up as we did every morning to be selected for work. And they began calling out numbers. All 3 of our numbers, my mother, Leah Sholem, my little brother, Oliver Sholem, and I, were called. We had to step forward. Everyone else went to work. We were packed into cattle trucks and sent to our next camp, which was a labor camp called Pretschu. Labor camp meant that you had to labor to retain your right to live. Unlike Riga, the first camp we had come from, which was unique in my experience, in that elderly people in that camp, when they could no longer do a solid day's work, were selected for murdering. But children were permitted to stay in the camp unmolested. They did not murder the children. I cannot find a reasonable explanation, except that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is in charge, which I didn't realize at that time. I didn't give HaKadosh Baruch Hu a thought in camps. And in this camp, each person was subjected to scrutiny. I was 13 years old. I said, "You'll do as a slave laborer," and that saved my life there. My brother was 4 years younger, and of course he couldn't work. So he was one of the ones marked for extermination. And eventually it did happen some 5 weeks later. Here you see a photograph of him. The one on the right, as you look at it, is my brother on the left and I. This was taken pre-war, of course. We lost everything in the camps. This photograph was saved by my father when he left Germany. He took some family photographs, and this is one of them. I see. So I'm not very good holding microphones. It's was a daily routine. Many people were taken to work in factories, manufacturing things to help the Nazi war effort. And my mother, Leah Sholem, and I became part of a group of 300 who were marched out each morning to a nearby, quite busy railway junction. The Allies had become aware that the Nazis were using the railway lines for all their military transportation, all reinforcements, armaments, food for the troops at the front line were sent by train. As a result, the Allies began bombing the German railway system, and our busy rail junction was a favorite. We, the group of 300, were used as a slave labor gang to dig out the bomb-damaged rails, level the ground, lay replacement rails to make the line serviceable against the Nazis could continue their military transportation. The Allies came back again and again to bomb, and we spent a whole year in that camp repairing bomb-damaged rails. As soon as we finished one spot, they took us elsewhere to do the same job again. It was a very cruel system because you were under watch of the guards. And once the guards found that people began to weaken, possibly because of the starvation diet or lack of hygiene, they were taken to a nearby execution site to be shot and replaced by people who have a bit more strength. On this picture showing now, it shows you what happened initially when people were asked to accompany them. They did so willingly, but when it became known that they were walking to their death, they refused. So this is what happened. They were tied to a pole, dragged by what is you read here as Latvian soldiers. In fact, they were all Latvian Nazis who had volunteered to work as our guards in the camp. Probably more than 90% of our guards were in fact these Latvian Nazis. and they were as cruel to us as any German. Work went on in that manner. There was one selection where people were so innocent as we shuffled forward until each one of us faced an SS officer. He would glance at each person and point left or right. People had no idea what this signified. And if the parents had pointed in one direction, the children in the other, the children sometimes begged him to point them in the same direction as their parents, so as not to split up the family. In fact, they didn't realize that they were attempting to commit suicide, because these elderly people, unlike the lies we were told, that they were being sent to another camp where the work would be easier for them, they were in fact taken away to be murdered. And it is substantiated online. Take my word for it. This was not the only time. It's a tactic they used repeatedly, trying to convince people that the elderly people would be taken care of, in fact, taken away to be. So time passed. We came home after a few weeks. Our brother and several other small children were allowed to stay in the camp initially during the day, and we were reunited. And we began to wonder whether these absolute sadistic brutes still had the spark of humanity in their hearts by allowing these children to live. At last, after several weeks of this, came home one day and found that the children had been taken away, never to be seen again. Life was so cruel in these camps that, heartbroken as we were at the disappearance of my little brother and my mother's little angel boy, the next morning we had to line up to go to work in order to stay alive and act as though nothing untoward had happened. This went on for a whole year. Eventually, we were all assembled for another selection. And I'm mentioning this briefly because it was different, and two remarkable things happened, which I'd like to tell you. I have to be, I think, much briefer than I am at the moment, or I'll be overrunning my allotted time. I'm not actually sure how much time I have been allotted, but there must be a limit. And what happened was that we all were taken in groups into a nearby hall. As we entered, this time we were asked to, not asked, ordered to strip naked. Naked, each one of us, men and women, we had to line up in single file, shuffle forward, each one to face an SS officer. While we were shuffling forward, the man behind me whispered to me, if by chance he asks you your age, say you're 17. We had to whisper very loudly, silently, because we were not allowed to speak. I took it aboard, and remarkably, when I faced the SS man, that was the question he asked me. And as I'd been prompted, I replied 17. And quite remarkably, he pointed me in the direction of those surviving. It was astounding. I have since found out that these SS selecting officers had been trained to some extent. And one of the things they were told, that from age 17, people made as a rule profitable slave laborers. And my feeling is that when he heard me say 17, he didn't bother even to look at me. 17 means you can survive, and that is how I survived. I had to walk to the outside to join my group of survivors. And soon after I got there, there was another group of people who were condemned to death, the ones who they felt no longer gave them value for money, slave laboring. And as I stood there, a small number from the condemned side began racing across as fast as their legs would carry them. to reach our group, mingle among us in order to disappear among us and save themselves. There were Nazi guards who were taken by surprise. So the first group got through, but then they stopped any more coming, and they came across and began searching. Some people were easily recognizable and were dragged back to the condemned side. And while this was going on, I saw that my mother on their show had been one of those racing across. I saw her hiding, naked, like me, among us. The guards did not recognize her. She saved herself that day, and she remained alive long enough to be liberated almost a year later together with me. So on that day, both of us had our lives saved. I think of my savior, the man behind me, prompted me about 17. As sometimes I think of him as a malach who was sent. I never saw him again. I don't know which way he was pointed, what happened to him. But that, I feel, is worth sharing with you. It didn't have any religious effect on me. That came much, much later. But days after this, we were packed. Incidentally, we never got our clothing back. We were issued these striped uniforms, which became standard in all the camps all over Europe. We were packed into cattle trucks, taken to our next camp, which turned out to be a concentration camp called Stuttgart. You're looking at the entrance gate to Stuttgart. It was known even during the war as the death gate, because once you walk through that gate into Stuttgart, effectively you were under a death sentence. Very, very few people left Stuttgart alive. Our little group of 300 became the envy of the thousands of people in Stuttgart when it became known that we would indeed be left alive to be taken to another camp. And indeed, after 3 weeks or so, we were packed into cattle trucks and transported to the next labor camp, which was called Stoll. We soon found out why we were so fortunate, because they put us to work on a similar railway junction as the one we had just left in the previous camp. And we realized that we had become a valuable source of skilled labor. We had been doing this work for a year now, and we're pretty good at repairing bomb-damaged rails. So they sent us to this next camp where we had to do exactly the same work. The starvation was as bad as in every other camp. And quite a number of military trains passed through this junction. Some of them stopped for time for wagons to be coupled onto them. And the rumor started that some of these wagons contained food for Nazi soldiers. And a group of our inmates, driven by hunger, actually broke the seal on a wagon, stole some food, and in revenge, the Nazis raided our camp and took 8 young men away with them. But this time, instead of them just disappearing by being shot, they built a large gallows in the center of the camp. And one day we all had to assemble and watch these 8 men being hanged one by one. Nazi soldiers patrolled among us, and if they saw anyone closing their eyes or turning their heads away, they would rifle butt us and threaten that unless we watched, there would be punishment, which could end up us hanging up there. That's how brutal the camp it was. Day after this event, which I have never forgotten, we were packed into cattle trucks, taken to our next camp, which was quite a small camp. And there, on the very first morning, as we all had to assemble, an SS officer walking along stopped in front of me, looked me up and down, and said, "When everyone else is sent off, you stay." I trembled with fear because being selected by a Nazi officer was not supposed to be a beneficial thing to happen. But I had to stop him. Eventually he came back, looked me up again and said, follow me. He took me into a building which had been erected particularly as accommodation for high-ranking SS officers. It's quite a large building. I don't know how many, but quite a good number of small flatlands. Each one of them occupied by a high-ranking SS man. He took me into his, and he, thank you, told me a huge number of things which I had to do for him. I'll just tell you some of the more major ones, perhaps. I had to wash the floor in his apartment, I had to make his bed, I had to brush his uniforms, etc. Dozens and dozens of things. And then he ordered me to do one major thing. Each day, I had to wash the common parts of the whole building from top to bottom. All the gangways, corridors, stairs, I had to wash down until each one gleamed, just like his boots, which I had to polish, I had to clean, and his uniforms, which I had to brush. They're not allowed to show a speck of dust of them. And I worked to the best of my ability. Because my mother, Leah Sholem, had drilled into me earlier on, if you're asked to do anything, don't be a knacker, don't try to sabotage it, do to the best of your ability. And I followed her and did whatever I did to the very best of my ability. But I was in terror because I knew I was totally in his power. And if I'd done anything to displease him, depending on his temperament, there was nothing to stop him pulling out his revolver from his belt and see me off. And as a result, each day was a day of terror. Fortunately, it lasted only for 3 weeks. We were packed into cattle trucks and taken into our next camp, which turned out to be the same camp again as the gate camp of Stuttgart. But now we were there as inmates, not in transit. This photograph shows you on the left just a few of the barracks. There were many, many of them. And Stuttgart also had a high voltage electric, high voltage electric fence surrounding it. But in addition, they had built guard towers, which you see on the right, to ensure they could not bear the thought of a single Jew trying to save themselves. And in fact, some people who were emaciated, barely walk due to lack of strength, sometimes tried to reach the high voltage fence to electrocute themselves. A few of them made it, but most of them were shot by the guards because we were not allowed to go near the fence. People died in the camp, in the beds every night, lifted out and taken to the crematorium for burning. People who were found dead in their beds, as I said, straight to the crematorium. And in that manner, we had to survive. Food was insufficient each day, the food ran out. People who were at the rear of the queue couldn't get any food anymore. Until 26th of April, 1945, during a morning assembly, numbers were called out again. My number was called. I had to step forward, and eventually close to 2,000 of us were lined up in a column and under armed SS guard were marched out of the camp of Stuttgart. Stuttgart had its own crematorium and gas chamber. Here you see image of what an oven in a gas chamber, in a crematorium looks like. I'm not showing you a gas chamber, but on the way from the train, there were trainloads of Jews from the east coming to Stuttgart, and most of them were lined up and marched straight to the gas chamber without entering the camp even. And on the way, they passed a mound of shoes. They had to take off their shoes and throw them onto the mound of shoes before they entered the gas chamber. And I'm showing this mound of shoes in order to help you understand the magnitude of the calamity I am describing to you. This photograph was taken apparently by a Russian soldier when Stuttgart was liberated. And these pairs of shoes, which had to be thrown onto the mound, grew to this size. I don't know how many there were, but there must have been close to 200,000. And I want you to imagine each pair of these shoes represents a human being who, a very short time later, after throwing their shoes in there, lost their life in the gas chamber. It may help you put some meaning to the numbers we speak about. 6 million is more or less inexplicable. I, who am much closer to all this, find it very difficult to put any meaning to it. But I hope that this will actually help you to gain a little understanding of what it was all about. As we left Stuttgart camp, accompanied, guarded by the SS, we saw a similar group of women leaving the adjoining ladies' camp where my mother was. She was in the same camp, but separate from me. I was in the men's and she was with the ladies. Neither of us knew whether the other would be marching or being left behind. And what happened was that after a while, the two columns were merged and there was one mixed long column. Anyone who didn't have the strength to keep up pace with the marching column and began trailing behind was shot by the guards without mercy. Many people lost their lives. By the afternoon of that day, long before I began searching for my mother, by making my way around through this long column, she likewise began searching for me. And after what seemed an eternity, during which we didn't know whether the other was left behind at the camp, we found each other. And of course, we stuck together. By afternoon, we reached a small port. There were 4 barges lined up, and they packed us into these 4 barges. We had to sit on the floor, legs wide apart. The next person would sit very close to us. 4 tugs appeared, which were manned by SS teams. They coupled themselves to the barges and told us to see. We had no idea where we were, what was in store for us. But we had to sit on the floor, just like that, and be towed. And we were on this sea for 6 days. Each day, at some point, we stopped. An SS officer appeared at the top of the barge, looked down at that mass of people sitting on the ground, legs wide apart, pushed together like sardines. And he selected at random up to around 25 victims each day who had to be dragged on deck and on his orders had to be thrown into the sea to drown. He said with a smirk on his face that they were using too much fuel towing us, therefore to lighten the load. 6 days in succession this happened. Just imagine the agony of not knowing who would be chosen, because it was totally random. On day 6, the tugs uncoupled themselves and left us unguarded, drifting at sea. We had on our group a small number of prisoners of war, who we know now were fed better diet in Stuttgart as prisoners of war than we Jews had been fed. And they had more strength. They clambered onto the top deck, shouted down that we were quite close to the shore, and they would attempt to get us ashore. they did something remarkable. They prized loose long floorboards, which they used as oars, distributing themselves around the outer perimeter of the barge. Incidentally, the photograph you see now is quite remarkable. This is a photograph of the very same barge that I was on for 6 days. And remarkably, you can see what I've just told you. It took about nearly 20 hours or so to cover a few hundred meters from where we were left drifting until in the middle of the night, late at night, shortly before dawn, we ran aground. And people who still had an ounce of strength began jumping off the barge, waded through the water to go ashore. But there were some people who, after these 6 days on the barge, during which, incidentally, we had no food, no water given to us, all of us were weak already from previous starvations, ongoingly daily starvation, and some of them were just bodies whose heart was still beating, but their minds were no longer functioning. So when the shout went up that we'd run ashore, we could jump off the barge, everyone who still had a little bit of strength clambered up, jumped, and waded ashore. These poor people who could no longer work out what was what stayed sitting and just awaited their fate. My mother persuaded me to jump. It was a very dark night. There was no sign of habitation anywhere. And when we all gathered ashore, off the barge, we didn't know which way to run. There was confusion and people had different ideas. Some said turn right, some said run inland. And while we were discussing which way to run, quite extraordinarily, the tug with the SS teams returned. It was pretty close to dawn the following morning. They had been away for many hours. They, of course, were livid seeing what we had done, and they split into two. One part boarded the barge, and all these unfortunate people I've just described to you, whose mind no longer functions, who were still there, were murdered. You heard the shots. Second group came ashore and rounded us up, lined us up, and we thought we would be the next to be shot. But they lined us up in a long column and told us to march. We marched again. Many people didn't have strength to keep up with the tempo of the march, which was set by the SS guards. And they were shot, each one of them as they trailed behind. Eventually, quite remarkably, they stopped shooting Jews, turned and run as fast as they could away from us. They had realized that the tank column, which was approaching, was one of Allied tanks. We didn't know the difference. When we were left without guards, there was such jubilation among us that I really am lost for words to tell you. Weak as we were, people found courage to express joyfulness about being free. There were no guards around, and the tanks were approaching us. But remarkably, while this was going on, as the tanks reached us, they moved past us, just rode past. We couldn't believe that they wouldn't stop for us. And eventually they were out of sight. We were now afraid that the Nazis might return. But within a short time, truckloads of British soldiers appeared. They stopped and began caring for us. They had trucks laden with food with them, and they began handing out food. And that was the moment of our miraculous liberation. I'm not sure how I forgot to look at the time I started. Do I have any extra time to go on, or do
We have another 3-4 minutes.
well, they marched us after allowing us to rest into the nearby town where we were housed in a Nazi complex. All the inmates had been taken away to prisoner of war camps, and we were housed in a large military compound, which had been used as a training school for underwater submarine training for teams of soldiers, Marines. We were both sent to hospital, typhus, both my mother and I. And after release, we were sent to a convalescent home where we were interviewed by welfare officers who we gave whatever sparse details we have of my father. It took them 3 months, but they made contact between us. My father, Father Shalom, applied for permission for us to join him. It took quite some time, but eventually we had a reunion in the UK. Of course, it was not a complete family any longer, but I was remarkably, extraordinarily lucky in having been a teenager, spending years in the camps, and now having both parents alive. I had a loving home, unlike the vast majority of teenagers who survived. The vast majority were complete orphans, had lost all their family. A very small number found one parent alive, but I was one in many, many hundreds of thousands who had both parents alive. As a result, I had major advantages, and I managed eventually to bring myself to a level of education, having missed 7 years. It took me 8 years, but I managed to go to university and I studied electronics and took a degree. But that was my special situation, which I have to be eternally grateful to my parents, among many, many other things I have reason to be grateful for. I think I must leave it here. I don't know if there's any time for any of you to ask any questions. I would be happy to answer if time is given.
Questions?
Any of you have a question, just raise your arm. Oh, there you are. There's a lady here. You have to speak loudly. My hearing is not.
When it all first started in the 1930s, why, like when they started putting restrictions on Jews, what they could and couldn't do, why did people not leave?
Why did we?
Why did people
Not
not
leave.
leave? Why did people not leave?
Because, as I tried to explain to you, apparently unsuccessfully, that no country wanted us. The vast majority of countries had closed borders, didn't want anyone.
That was later on, even earlier.
Sorry?
Even earlier, perhaps when it really first started.
I cannot answer that question. My parents were on the waiting list for visas to America for years. They applied pretty early, but America had an annual quota of 30,000 and a waiting list of more than 300,000. So it was miraculous. You had to wait years. And my parents later told me that each time they felt that they had got near the top of the waiting list, the American authorities changed the requirements, and they had to provide some additional information, which every time put it back, and it never happened. It was not for lack of trying, but that was life. Some people managed somehow to buy visas, but even that didn't always work. Sometimes they paid a lot of money, and then they were stopped at the border, not allowed in. But some people were resourceful, as I told you, and smuggled themselves into neighboring countries in desperation. And that unfortunately also backfired. So I hope that's the answer to your question. It was not, everyone saw the writing on the wall, but people just couldn't. Some people who had close relatives in America managed to get guarantors, which were required, and managed to get some relations out. but it was extraordinarily difficult. You cannot imagine nowadays tens, hundreds of thousands of so-called refugees, many of them economic refugees, have a choice of countries. They can actually turn down an offer of refuge and choose the country they want. In those days, halavai, that had been the case. There would have been no Jew left in Germany, but it didn't work that way. And that is why, initially, when the Nazis came to power, there were about 500,000 Jews in Germany. By 1939, when the war started, that number had dwindled to half. But some of them had smuggled themselves into neighboring countries and they were caught later on. So some people did manage to save themselves, but it was a trickle rather than a flood, which it would have been, had there been somewhere to flee to. Thank you. Anybody else? Yes, speak loudly, please.
How did the TV meet?
It's too long a story. And too amusing for Tisha.
I'd like to thank Mr. Goldberg for his very, very inspiring elections and memories. And if I would have a question, I mean, we're running out of time. It's how you managed to maintain and retain your emunah after seeing all the horror that you saw in the Holocaust. We'll just end with one minute of that.
It's also
It's really too long, but I'll try and tell you very briefly. I used to be too embarrassed to speak about it, but some time ago I made up my mind. I am who I am and what I am. My past is nothing to be ashamed of. Then I finally, in the camps, I did not give the Almighty a thought, not once, because I didn't do what I believe some people did. So I made a promise to the Almighty, if you save my life, I undertake to do so and so after my liberation. That didn't occur to me. I did not think of the Almighty all these years in camp, not once. Then I reached my father after the war, about a year or so after the war. My father, despite all his trials and tribulations, remained a devout Jew. He had spent more than 4 years in yeshiva as a youngster, and he was still a devout Jew, member of a Rum shul in Stamford Hill. And when I arrived, he gave me a siddur, showed me how to put on tefillin, which I didn't have until then, I was 16 years old. And he took me to shul and began teaching me how to daven, put on tefillin, etc. But this is what really could be considered embarrassing. When I was given a siddur with a German translation, I began to understand how we address the Almighty in our prayers. And I began to read that God is considered to be not only almighty, but also just, merciful, kind. And when I conjured up some memories of what happened to us in the camps, I couldn't understand. How can a God who was so merciful and kind have allowed this to happen to us? And there was turmoil in my mind. But extraordinarily, I was too, I'm not sure whether to say embarrassed or in some way inhibited to tell my parents, particularly my father, about this. And I began playing a role. Outwardly, I wore a kippah, I went to shul, I put on tefillin, but inwardly, there was turmoil in me when I said the words of prayer. It kept on coming into my mind. How can that be? It's irreconcilable. And it took me quite some time it's too long if I go into details, but there was a particular graph where Yisroel Levi HaKohen, no, Rabbi Levi Cohen Halevi, Yisroel Cohen Halevi, who approached me. I have no time to go into details. He lived around the corner from us and he asked me to come to him on Shabbos afternoons for learning. I remember when we were doing a bit of college at one point, somewhere in Vayikra, I think, Moshe Rabbeinu asks HaKadosh Baruch Hu for an insight of how the Rebbeinu Shalom works, how he runs the world. And I remember the Rebbeinu Shalom saying to Moshe, my ways are not your ways. It's not possible for any human being. And that phrase has stuck in my mind. And as I began to develop when I came to this country, age 16, don't forget I had the mental education of a 9-year-old, but gradually I began absorbing things. I worked hard, catching up my education. In fact, so well that years later I managed to go to university. First time I was refused, second time they accepted me. But it became clear to me that we live our lives here surrounded by miracles. I began to read a lot to try and catch up on the large hole in my mind, lost education. And it became clear to me that, for instance, the birth of a human being is a miracle unparalleled. The seasons of the year, the way apple trees grow apples, pear trees grow pears. You'll never find an apple on a pear tree. Who directs this? You put little seeds in the ground, and fruit comes out. I read that if we were any closer to the sun, it couldn't live, it would be too hot. A bit further away, it would be too cold. Who organized this? The world seems a highly, highly regulated machine, more complex than any other machine I can think of. What keeps my heart beating? What keeps me breathing? I don't know I'm breathing. I'm somehow doing it. My heart's been beating for 95 years now. Why? How? Who does it? And all that combined began to impinge on me that there must be someone running this world. It also became clear to me that the Almighty, I pray to daily now in Shul, is the same Almighty that Avraham Avinu prayed to thousands of years ago, which means, of course, that this God must be everlasting. And it became clear to me that if we do not understand, it must be God's will that we do not. And eventually, it really impinged on my mind that HaKadosh Baruch Hu does not want us to understand. He wants us to have faith in Almighty God, not believe in God because we can reason how He works the world. It'd be easy to be a goodie if we knew what reward we get for what we do. We could all be goodies. So this is not what Almighty has blessed us with. Free will means that you have to have faith even in something you cannot fully comprehend. And once I realized that the Almighty must have willed it for our finite minds not to understand the way we would like to, what He did for us or to us, or inflicted on us, whichever way you want to put it. Nevertheless, HaKadosh Baruch Hu is in charge of running this world, and we are bound to have faith in Him. And that is how I built my faith and became an abiding, observant Jew ever since. Thank you very much.
Thank you to Bruce also for sending you all up today.
Was that cancelled?
Reading from notes.